The factory still stands at 14 Hofler Avenue in Ilion, New York. 1 million square feet of brick and silence in the dead center of a village that was built around it. For 208 years, this was the oldest continuously operating gun factory in America. Rifles forged here armed Union soldiers, equipped frontier settlers, and outfitted the militaries of dozens of nations across 5 continents. At its peak, over 3,000 workers clocked in across 3 shifts, and the afternoon traffic jams when the day shift let out defined the rhythm of the town. On March 4, 2024, the last 300 workers walked out for good. How does America's oldest gun maker lose its own home? The story of Remington is more than just a corporate chronicle. It's an autopsy of a fading era. Let me know in the comments, which legendary company or forgotten factory would you like to see featured in our next investigation? And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes about industrial empires and the businesses whose decisions changed the course of history. The story of Remington begins not with a factory or a fortune, but with a forge. A blacksmith's forge in the backwoods of Herkimer County, New York, where a family of Connecticut transplants was trying to build a life out of raw land and iron. Eliphalet Remington Sr. had moved his wife Elizabeth and their children west from Suffield, Connecticut, around 1800. Chasing what every restless New Englander chased in those years: acreage, opportunity, and distance from the settled world's limitations. They found land in the Mohawk Valley, a stretch of rolling hills and swift creeks that dropped 1,000 feet on their way to the Mohawk River. The valley was rich in water power, which mattered more than gold in an era before steam engines and electricity. You could harness a creek to drive a hammer, spin a lathe, or grind grain. The Remingtons built a farm. Then they built a forge. Eliphalet Sr. was a practical man. He made farm equipment, repaired tools, and ran the forge as a supplement to the family's agricultural income. His son, Eliphalet Jr., born October 28, 1793, grew up swinging hammers and shaping iron before he could read with any fluency. The boy had a gift for metalwork that went beyond competence. There's a story, probably true, that when the family wanted silver spoons made for his sister Mary, they sent young Eliphalet to watch a silversmith work for a day. He came home, went to the forge, and made the spoons himself. They were fine. Here's the thing about Eliphalet Remington Jr. He wasn't a visionary. He wasn't a showman. He wasn't Samuel Colt, who would tour the country as a fake doctor and hand-deliver engraved revolvers to foreign monarchs and tell anyone within earshot that God made men but Colt made them equal. Eliphalet Remington was a blacksmith's son who believed he could build a better gun than he could buy. That's it. No grand theory, no carnival act, just the quiet conviction that his hands and his forge could produce something worth owning. In 1816, at the age of 23, he put that conviction to the test. He took scrap iron and, using the water-powered trip hammers in his father's shop, forged a rifle barrel. The process was brutal and precise. You heated the iron until it glowed, hammered it around a mandrel to form the tube, welded the seam, and ground it smooth. It took days. When the barrel was finished, Eliphalet walked 15 miles to Utica, where a gunsmith named Morgan James reamed and rifled the bore. James was so impressed with the quality of the barrel that he helped Eliphalet fit it with a lock mechanism. The young man walked home, built a stock, and had himself a rifle. He entered a local shooting match with that homemade gun. He finished second, didn't win, but here's the kicker. The man who won asked to try Remington's rifle, shot better with it than he had with his own gun, and ordered a barrel on the spot. Before Eliphalet left the field that afternoon, he had more orders than he could fill. He walked home a gunmaker. Picture this: a 23-year-old kid in homespun clothes carrying a rifle he forged himself, walking away from a county shooting match with a fistful of orders and absolutely no idea that he'd just launched a dynasty that would last 2 centuries. No investors, no patents, no business plan. Just a reputation for making something that shot straight. He and his father started filling those orders immediately. Father and son, side by side in the forge, hammering barrels from dawn to dark. Word spread through the Mohawk Valley and beyond. Remington barrels were accurate, durable, and reasonably priced. Other gunsmiths started buying Remington barrels to fit into their own rifles. The small forge in Ilion Gulch couldn't keep up. They hired assistants. They brought in more machinery. By the early 1820s, Remington barrels were shipping as far as New England, transported via the Erie Canal, which had transformed the economics of upstate New York overnight. The canal changed everything. Suddenly, a forge in the middle of nowhere had access to markets hundreds of miles away. Raw materials could come in, finished products could go out. The Mohawk Valley, which had been a backwater, became a corridor of commerce. Remington saw the opportunity clearly. In 1828, the family purchased 100 acres of land along the canal, near a settlement called Morgan's Landing, which would later become the village of Ilion. They planned to build a proper factory, one with direct canal access for shipping and water power from nearby creeks for running the machinery. The move should have been a triumph. Instead, it began with tragedy. Eliphalet Sr. was helping transport equipment to the new site when he fell beneath the wheel of a loaded timber wagon. He died 5 days later. His son, 35 years old, suddenly sole proprietor of a growing business, buried his father, and got back to work. There was no other option. The orders wouldn't wait. The new factory rose on the banks of the canal. Well, it was modest by the standards of what it would become, but it was purpose-built for gun manufacturing, with water-powered machinery that could forge, drill, and finish barrels faster than anything the hand forge in the Gulch had managed. By 1832, Remington employed 20 men and was producing barrels and other metal goods at a pace that forced competitors across New York to fold or find niches he hadn't claimed. Eliphalet's sons entered the business one by one. Philo joined first, and the firm became E. Remington and Son. Then Samuel arrived, and the name expanded to E. Remington and Sons. Eventually, Eliphalet III joined as well. It was a family operation in the deepest sense. Father and sons working the same floors, making decisions together, sharing both the profits and the risk. The Remington stamp on a barrel meant something personal. It meant a family had put its name on the product because they were willing to stake their reputation on every piece of iron that left the building. By 1840, Remington dominated the barrel-making trade in upstate New York. By 1850, they employed 50 people. By 1855, 75. The growth was steady, not explosive. Eliphalet Remington didn't chase flash. He chased consistency. He improved his processes incrementally, invested in better machinery when he could afford it, and maintained the quality standards that had earned him his reputation at that shooting match 39 years earlier. And then the government came calling, not with a small order this time, with a contract that would change the scale of everything Remington had built. In 1845, a gunmaker in Cincinnati named John Griffith defaulted on a federal contract to produce 5,000 Model 1841 percussion rifles for the United States Army. The Model 1841 was a single-shot muzzleloader bored to .54 caliber, a rugged workhorse of a weapon that soldiers called the Mississippi Rifle, after Jefferson Davis's regiment carried it with distinction during the Mexican-American War. Griffith couldn't deliver. The government needed someone who could. They turned to Remington. It was the company's first major military contract, and it changed the trajectory of everything. Eliphalet Remington and his sons tooled up production, hired additional workers, and delivered every rifle on time and to specification. The quality was impeccable. A second contract followed almost immediately, this one for 7,500 more of the same model. Then came an order from the United States Navy for 1,000 Jenks breech-loading carbines, making Remington the supplier of the Navy's first breech-loading rifle. Each contract built on the last. Each delivery proved that this family operation in the Mohawk Valley could manufacture at military scale without sacrificing the precision that had built their reputation. The Mexican-American War, which erupted in 1846, accelerated the process. Suddenly, the government needed weapons at volume. Remington filled orders for rifles and carbines that would see service from the Rio Grande to Mexico City. The profits were real, but not transformative. What mattered more was the credential. Remington had proven it could be trusted by the federal government. That trust would become the foundation of everything that followed. Eliphalet Remington himself didn't live to see what his company would become. He died on August 12, 1861, just months after Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter, and the nation tore itself apart. He was 67 years old. His son Philo took over the firm during the most consequential moment in its history. The Civil War was about to turn a regional barrel maker into a national arms power. The Union Army needed weapons in quantities that staggered the imagination. The government's own arsenal at Springfield, Massachusetts, couldn't keep pace with demand. Private manufacturers scrambled to fill the gap, and Remington was positioned perfectly. The Ilion factory had the machinery, the workforce, and the track record. Orders poured in, rifles, carbines, and for the first time, revolvers. Let that sink in. Remington had never manufactured handguns before the Civil War. They were a long gun company, rifle makers to the core, but the Army needed sidearms, and Remington adapted with a speed that would have impressed even Samuel Colt. They developed the new model Army revolver in .44 caliber and the new model Navy in .36 caliber, both solid, reliable weapons that soldiers carried alongside their Colt counterparts. The Remington revolvers were arguably better designed, with a solid top strap across the frame that made them stronger and more accurate than the open-top Colts. Soldiers who carried both often preferred the Remington. Production exploded. At times, every man and boy in the town of Ilion worked day and night for weeks to meet contract deadlines. The factory expanded with temporary production facilities to handle revolver manufacturing. A steam generation system was installed to supplement the water power that had driven the operation since its founding. The noise never stopped. Hammers falling, drills grinding, metal being shaped into instruments of war at a pace Eliphalet Sr. could never have imagined when he built that first forge in the Gulch. By the time Lee surrendered at Appomattox in April 1865, Remington had produced nearly $3 million worth of weapons for the Union. That's roughly $60 million in today's money. The company delivered approximately 250,000 rifles, carbines, and revolvers, a figure that rivaled Colt's output during the same period. Remington had entered the war as a respected regional manufacturer. It emerged as one of the two most important firearms producers in America. And then the war ended, and the contracts stopped. And for the first time, Remington faced the question that would haunt it for the next 160 years. What do you sell when peace breaks out? The answer, for a while, was the rolling block rifle. And it was brilliant. Developed in 1865 by Leonard Geiger and perfected by Joseph Ryder, the rolling block was a single-shot breech loader with the simplest and strongest action design of its era. The mechanism consisted of just 25 moving parts. An expert rifleman could fire 17 shots per minute. It was accurate, virtually indestructible, and cheap to manufacture. The U.S. Army tested it, but chose the Springfield trapdoor rifle instead, largely because the Springfield could be produced by converting existing muzzle loaders, which saved money. The domestic military market slipped away. Here's the thing about Remington in those years. When America said no, they sold to the world. Samuel Remington, Eliphalet's second son, crossed the Atlantic in 1866 to demonstrate the rolling block in Europe. the reception was extraordinary. At the 1867 Paris Exposition, an International Firearms Commission examined every major military rifle on the planet and declared the Remington rolling block the finest rifle in the world. They awarded it the Silver Medal, the highest honor available. Orders cascaded in from every continent. Sweden and Norway adopted the rolling block as their standard military rifle in 1867, the first nations to do so. Denmark followed immediately, ordering 42,000 rifles and 1,800 carbines. And Spain made it the chief service arm of the Spanish army from 1869 to 1893. Egypt bought an estimated 250,000. France, desperate for weapons during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, purchased 210,000 in a single frantic order. Argentina armed its soldiers with rolling blocks. Mexico bought tens of thousands over 4 decades. Even the Papal States, the tiny territory governed by the Vatican, ordered Remington rifles to equip its guards. A gun forged in a small valley town in upstate New York was being carried by soldiers from Scandinavia to South America, from the deserts of Egypt to the plains of Argentina. Let that sink in. Over 1.5 million rolling block military rifles were exported by the turn of the century. The Remington name was stamped on weapons in dozens of languages. It carried into battles that the people of Ilion would never hear about. It was the most successful global arms export program any American company had achieved. Back home, civilians were buying them too. By the fall of 1866, cases of rolling block rifles had reached Kansas, Texas, and Colorado territory. Buffalo hunters prized them. Frontier settlers relied on them. George Armstrong Custer himself praised the rolling block for its power against large game. The gun that the U.S. Army had rejected became the gun that helped settle the West. But the Remington brothers weren't content with firearms alone. With the Civil War boom fading and domestic military orders drying up, they looked for new products to sustain the factory's workforce. In 1856, they had already expanded into agricultural implements. After the war, they added sewing machines. Then, in 1873, they made a decision that would echo through the history of technology far beyond anything their rifles accomplished. E. Remington and Sons began manufacturing the first commercial typewriter. The Scholes and Glidden typewriter, featuring the QWERTY keyboard layout that you're still using today, was produced at the Ilion factory starting in March 1873. The same workers who machined rifle barrels and assembled revolver cylinders were building the machines that would transform business communication for the next century. The QWERTY layout, arguably Remington's most enduring contribution to civilization, was designed by Christopher Scholes and commercialized by the very company whose primary business was killing machines. It was a bold diversification play. Typewriters, sewing machines, agricultural equipment. The logic was sound. Spread the risk. Keep the factory running when military orders dried up. Use the precision manufacturing skills that firearms production had developed and apply them to civilian products. Here's the kicker. It didn't work. Not in the way that mattered. The sewing machine operation was destroyed when the Chicago fire of 1874 burned Remington's sewing machine subsidiary to the ground. The agricultural implements business never gained enough traction to justify the investment. The typewriter would eventually become enormously successful, but not in time to save the company that created it. In 1886, Remington spun off the typewriter division, which would later evolve into Remington Rand, then Sperry Rand, then Unisys. The typewriter business thrived. The gun business did not. By the mid-1880s, the Remington brothers' diversification strategy had drained resources without generating the returns needed to offset declining arms sales. The post-Civil War boom was a distant memory. European competitors were manufacturing their own versions of the rolling block under license. The American civilian market was saturated with surplus weapons, and the economy was suffering through a prolonged depression that crushed consumer spending across every industry. In 1886, E. Remington and Sons went bankrupt. The court appointed two local men to stabilize the company and sort through the wreckage. Workers, loyal to the family that had employed their town for 70 years, were paid not in cash, but in company scrip. Eat paper I owe us, that local merchants accepted as currency, because everyone in Ilion understood that the factory's survival was the town's survival. If Remington went down, everything went down. 2 years later, in March 1888, the Remington family sold the company to Marcellus Hartley and his partners, a group of New York sporting goods dealers who also owned the Union Metallic Cartridge Company and had ties to Winchester. The purchase price ended 72 years of family ownership. Eliphalet Remington III, the founder's grandson, lived until 1924, eventually dying nearly penniless, financially dependent on Syracuse University, where he served as a trustee. He watched from the outside as strangers reshaped the business his grandfather had built, from scrap iron and stubbornness. The company survived. The Remington name survived. The factory in Ilion survived, but something fundamental had died. It was no longer a family. It was an asset. And assets get managed differently than legacies. Under Marcellus Hartley's new ownership, Remington shed its failing sidelines and refocused on what it knew best. The typewriters were already gone. The sewing machines were finished. The agricultural tools were abandoned. What remained was the core business, firearms, and the infrastructure to produce them at scale. Hartley merged Remington with his Union Metallic Cartridge Company, and by 1912 the combined entity became Remington UMC, a company that could manufacture both the gun and the ammunition it fired. It was a logical consolidation that should have positioned Remington for dominance in the 20th century. Then Europe set itself on fire. On June 28, 1914, the Crown Prince of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo. And within weeks, the great powers of Europe were marching toward the most destructive conflict the world had ever seen. While America remained officially neutral, its factories did not. Britain contracted Remington to produce pattern 14 rifles in .303 caliber. France placed orders. Russia placed orders. The Ilion factory, which had been limping along on modest civilian sales, and the occasional government contract, suddenly faced demand that dwarfed anything it had experienced since the Civil War. In 1915, construction began on a massive expansion of the Ilion plant. By the spring of 1916, the new facilities were operational. Here's the thing about that expansion. It wasn't a temporary wartime annex. It was essentially the same factory that would stand for the next 100 years. The building that workers would walk into and out of for generations, the structure that still dominates the center of Ilion today. The bricks laid in 1915 are the bricks that the last workers passed on their way out in 2024. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, Remington was already running at full capacity. American military orders piled on top of the Allied contracts already in production. The numbers were staggering. Over the course of World War I, more than 2 million rifles were produced at the Ilion plant and at a second Remington-owned facility. Employment surged past 10,000 workers. The factory ran around the clock, 3 shifts of men and women feeding raw steel into machines that turned it into instruments of industrial-scale killing. The Mohawk Valley hummed with the sound of production. And the money that flowed into Ilion transformed the community. Workers earned steady wages. Businesses thrived on factory spending. The town and the company were once again inseparable. And then the armistice came, November 11th, 1918. The guns stopped. The orders stopped. Picture this: a factory built for war, running at capacity 1 month, sitting half empty the next. 10,000 workers suddenly wondering whether they'd have jobs by Christmas, military contracts evaporating like morning fog, warehouses stacked with rifles that nobody needed anymore. This was the pattern establishing itself, and anyone paying attention could have read its rhythm like sheet music. War brought prosperity. Peace brought crisis. Every time the guns stopped firing overseas, the orders stopped coming from Washington and foreign capitals. Ideas in the factory that had been running at capacity suddenly went quiet. The company scrambled to diversify. Again. In 1918, Remington introduced its first cash register, hoping to leverage its precision manufacturing capabilities into a new consumer market. Sales were strong through most of the 1920s. They also branched into cutlery, producing pocket knives and hunting knives. They manufactured household utensils. They even sold decorative patches bearing the Remington logo, which eventually evolved into a small clothing and accessories business. It was the same desperate logic that had driven the typewriter and sewing machine ventures a generation earlier. Find something, anything, that people will buy when they're not buying guns. The Great Depression crushed those hopes along with everything else. Cash register sales collapsed. The cutlery business stalled. By the early 1930s, Remington employed only 300 workers at its core Ilion plant. 300. Let that sink in. Down from over 10,000 during the war. The factory that had armed the Allied powers sat nearly empty, its machinery idle, its workforce gutted to a skeleton crew. The buildings were still there. The machines were still there. The knowledge of how to build rifles at scale was still there. What was missing was anyone willing to pay for it. In 1931, Remington sold the cash register business to National Cash Register Company in a last-ditch attempt to stabilize its finances. It wasn't enough. The company needed a partner with deep pockets and a long-term commitment to the firearms industry. In 1933, it found one. A. Dupont de Nemours and Company, better known as DuPont, purchased a 60% stake in Remington Arms. The marriage made a certain poetic sense. DuPont had been founded in 1802 as a manufacturer of gunpowder and explosives. For over a century, they had been making the propellant that Remington's guns used to fire their bullets. Now the powder maker owned the gun maker. DuPont brought something Remington hadn't had in decades: capital, patience, and professional management. They tore down several unneeded buildings at the Ilion plant. They refurbished aging facilities. They invested in modern machinery and updated manufacturing processes. Under DuPont's direction, Remington wasn't just stabilized, it was rebuilt. By the late 1930s, Remington was well positioned for what was coming next. And what was coming next was the largest war in human history. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and the world began its second descent into global conflict, Remington mobilized with an efficiency born of bitter experience. They manufactured M1903 Springfield rifles, the bolt-action workhorses of American infantry. They produced M1911 pistols, the .45 caliber sidearms that John Moses Browning had designed and that Colt had made famous. They built machine gun components, ammunition by the millions of rounds, and specialized military equipment that kept the supply chain feeding the front lines. Employment peaked again. The Ilion factory ran 3 shifts around the clock, just as it had during the First War. Thousands of workers filled the production floors, many of them women who took over positions traditionally held by men now serving overseas. The money flowed. The town prospered. What the pattern held: war meant work. War meant purpose. War meant survival. Walk inside that factory in 1943, the noise hits you before anything else, a mechanical roar that bounces off brick walls and iron columns and never stops, not for a second, not even between shifts. because the next shift is already feeding the machines before the last one has cleared the floor. Lathes spin, drill presses punch through steel, conveyor systems carry components from one station to the next in an endless metallic river. Natural light pours through tall windows, illuminating clouds of metal dust that hang in the air like industrial fog. There's a smell to it, cutting oil and hot metal, and the faint acrid tang of cleaning solvents. Workers in coveralls move between machines with practiced efficiency, each one performing a specific task in a chain that transforms raw steel into finished weapons. This is what peak production looks like. This is what purpose sounds like. 1,000 small acts of precision, repeated 10,000 times a day, feeding a war machine that stretches from this valley in upstate New York to the beaches of Normandy and the islands of the Pacific. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the pattern completed itself once more. Military contracts dried up. The workforce shrank. The machinery slowed. But this time, something was different. DuPont was still at the helm, and DuPont thought in decades, not quarters. Instead of panicking when peacetime arrived, they pivoted Remington toward a strategy that would sustain the company for the next half-century, become the dominant brand in American sporting firearms. The logic was straightforward. Millions of American men had returned from the war trained in the use of firearms. Hunting was deeply embedded in American rural culture. The post-war economic boom was putting disposable income into the hands of working-class and middle-class families who could now afford to hunt for sport, not just survival. Remington, with its military credibility and its manufacturing capacity, was perfectly positioned to supply this market. The transition began immediately. Remington invested in designing and producing sporting rifles and shotguns that combined military-grade durability with the fit, finish, and accuracy that civilian hunters demanded. They built relationships with retailers and distributors across the country. They advertised in hunting magazines and sponsored shooting sports. For the first time in its history, the company was building something that looked like a sustainable civilian business. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the explosive growth of wartime production, but it was stable. And stability was something Remington had never truly known. Whether that stability would hold when the ownership changed was another question entirely, one the next generation of owners would answer very differently. The guns that came out of Ilion in the 1950s and 1960s weren't just products. They were institutions. 3 models in particular defined Remington's golden age and cemented its place in the American sporting tradition so deeply that their names became shorthand for entire categories of firearm. The Model 870 pump-action shotgun arrived in 1950. It never left. It was, and remains, the most popular pump shotgun ever manufactured. The design was elegant in its simplicity, a reliable pump action, a smooth cycling mechanism, and a build quality that could withstand decades of abuse in duck blinds, deer camps, and police cruisers across the country. Over 11 million Model 870s have been produced. Let that sink in. 11 million. That's not a product. That's a cultural artifact. If you grew up in rural America between 1950 and 2000, the odds are overwhelming that someone in your family owned an 870. It was the gun your father taught you to shoot with, the gun that hung above the mantel, the gun you inherited when he died. Then came the Model 700 bolt-action rifle in 1962, and it became the most popular bolt-action rifle in American history. Accurate, affordable, and available in virtually every caliber a hunter could want. The 700 was the rifle that accompanied generations of Americans into the woods every November. More than 5 million were sold. The U.S. military adopted a modified version as its standard sniper platform, the M24 Sniper Weapon System, which served from the late 1980s through the War on Terror. The 700's action became the foundation for an entire aftermarket industry of custom rifles, as with gunsmiths across the country building precision competition and hunting rifles around the Remington receiver. It was the most important American rifle design of the second half of the 20th century. The Model 1100 semi-automatic shotgun completed the trinity in 1963. It offered the reliability of the 870 with the convenience of gas-operated semi-automatic cycling. Trap shooters, skeet shooters, and upland bird hunters adopted it immediately. It became the best-selling auto-loading shotgun in history. Here's the thing about those three guns. They didn't just generate revenue. They generated identity. Remington wasn't Colt, with its mythology of frontier justice and Wild West romance. Remington was the workingman's gun company, the brand for hunters, for farmers, for people who used firearms as tools rather than symbols. With the 870 and the 700 and the 1100 were reliable, unpretentious, and built to last. They reflected the values of the communities that bought them and the community that built them. Picture this: Ilion, New York, in the 1970s, a village of fewer than 9,000 people anchored entirely by a single factory. The Remington plant employs over 3,000 workers across 3 shifts. The parking lot fills before dawn and empties after dark. When the day shift lets out in the afternoon, traffic backs up through the center of town, a river of pickup trucks and sedans flowing away from the factory gates. Everyone knows someone who works at the plant. For many families, employment at Remington is practically a birthright passed down like the 870 hanging above the fireplace. Your grandfather worked the floor. Your father ran a lathe. You started in shipping and moved to assembly. Your son is applying for an apprenticeship. The company isn't just an employer. It's the architecture of daily life. Walk through town and you see it everywhere. The village seal features Eliphalet Remington holding a long gun, standing watch over the community he created. Armory Street runs alongside the factory. Remington Avenue connects it to the rest of the village. The local bars fill up after shift changes. The pizza shops deliver to the factory entrance. The churches hold services timed to accommodate the shift schedule. Ilion doesn't exist adjacent to the Remington factory. Ilion exists because of the Remington factory. Remove one and the other has no reason to be there. The workers inside those walls carried knowledge that couldn't be written in a manual. And machinists who had spent 30 years on the same equipment understood tolerances by feel, by sound, by the way metal behaved under a specific cutter at a specific speed. They could hear when a drill bit was wearing down before any instrument could measure it. They knew the machines the way a musician knows an instrument, intuitively, physically, in their hands and their bones. That institutional knowledge accumulated over generations and passed from worker to worker on the shop floor, was the real asset that made Remington rifles shoot straight and Remington shotguns cycle clean. No corporate balance sheet ever captured its value. No private equity analyst ever factored it into a deal. But beneath the stability of the DuPont era, structural vulnerabilities were building that no amount of shop floor expertise could fix. The first was the slow, largely invisible decline of American hunting culture. Through the 1950s and 1960s, hunting had been a mainstream activity, something millions of families did as naturally as going to church or watching football. But suburbanization was pulling Americans away from the rural landscapes where hunting traditions had been rooted. Fewer young people were growing up on farms. Fewer families had direct connections to the land. The National Sporting Goods Manufacturers Association tracked the shift. Rifle and shotgun sales, which represented 75% of Remington's revenue, had been softening since the mid-1980s. It was a slow bleed, not a crisis, but it meant that the civilian market Remington had spent decades building was gradually eroding underneath it. But the second vulnerability was the one that had haunted the company since 1865, war dependency. DuPont's management had done a remarkable job of building the sporting business, but Remington's factory was still sized for wartime production. The massive Ilion plant, with its million square feet of manufacturing space spread across multiple buildings dating to the World War I expansion, was designed to produce weapons at a scale that peacetime demand could never justify. The overhead was enormous, heating those buildings in upstate New York winters, maintaining century-old infrastructure, paying property taxes on 34 acres of industrial real estate in the center of a small village. The fixed costs didn't shrink when orders did, and then the stable era ended. In 1993, DuPont sold Remington to Clayton, Dubilier, and Rice in a New York investment firm for approximately $300 million. After 60 years of ownership, the chemical giant exited the firearms business. DuPont was reshaping itself as a science and technology company. Firearms didn't fit the new corporate identity. The social politics of gun ownership were becoming increasingly fraught, and DuPont's board had little appetite for the controversies that came with being a gun manufacturer in an era of rising gun control advocacy. Here's the kicker. The sale marked the end of something Remington had experienced only twice before in its history: long-term, stable ownership. The Remington family had run the company for 72 years. DuPont had steered it for 60. Now it belonged to a private equity firm whose business model was fundamentally different from either. Private equity firms buy companies, or restructure them, and sell them at a profit. The timeline is years, not decades. The priority is return on investment, not institutional continuity. Remington had entered the era of financial engineering. The transition didn't cause immediate damage. Clayton, Dubilier, and Rice ran the company competently through the 1990s, but the sale established a precedent that would prove catastrophic. Remington was now a commodity on the financial markets, something to be traded, leveraged, and optimized for extraction. The next buyer would be far less gentle. In 2007, Cerberus Capital Management, a private equity firm named after the three-headed dog that guards the gates of hell in Greek mythology, acquired Remington for $370 million. The deal included $118 million in cash and the assumption of $252 million in existing debt. Cerberus folded Remington into a new entity called the Freedom Group, a holding company that would eventually absorb Bushmaster, DPMS Marlin, and other firearms brands into a single corporate structure. Let that sink in. Remington, the company that Eliphalet Remington had founded in a blacksmith's forge, that had armed the Union, conquered the global arms trade, and defined American sporting firearms for a century, was now a subsidiary of a holding company controlled by a private equity fund, named after a mythological hellhound. The workers in Ilion still machined the same parts on the same floors. The 800s and 70s still shipped to the same dealers, but the decisions about the company's future were now being made by financiers in Manhattan whose primary expertise was not building guns, but structuring debt. The consequences of that shift would unfold over the next 15 years, and they would destroy almost everything the Remington name had ever meant. Cerberus Capital Management did what private equity firms do. They loaded Remington with debt. The mechanics are worth understanding because they explain not just what happened to Remington, but what happens to hundreds of American companies every year. In a leveraged buyout, the acquiring firm doesn't use its own money to buy the target company. It uses the target company's assets as collateral to borrow the purchase price. The debt lands on the acquired company's balance sheet. The company itself is forced to service loans that were taken out to buy it. Imagine someone buying your house, putting the mortgage in your name, and then collecting rent from you to cover their investment. That's the basic structure. Cerberus created a holding company, placed Remington inside it, and began borrowing. In 2010, the holding company took out $225 million from a group of lenders, likely hedge funds. Because the loan was risky, the terms were generous for the lenders and punishing for Remington. In 2013, Cerberus used the proceeds from a new debt sale to pay off its own equity investors. Read that again. The money that Remington had borrowed for operating capital was used to pay Cerberus's investors. The company's cash reserves were drained to enrich the people who owned it. By the mid-2000s, Remington was carrying nearly $1 billion in debt. $1 billion. For a company that manufactured rifles and shotguns in a small town in upstate New York. The interest payments alone consumed tens of millions of dollars annually, money that should have gone to research and development, to modernizing the aging Ilion factory, to investing in new product lines, to maintaining quality control, instead flowed out the door to service debt that existed solely because a private equity firm had used Remington as a financial instrument. Here's the kicker. Remington was still profitable during much of this period. In the first 9 months of 2016, the company earned $19 million in profit after paying $45 million in interest to its creditors. It was making money. The business worked. The problem wasn't the products or the people who built them. The problem was the billion-dollar anchor that had been chained to the hull. And while the financial engineers in Manhattan were extracting value from the Remington brand, something far darker was unfolding inside one of Remington's most iconic products, the Model 700, the most popular bolt-action rifle in American history. 5 million sold. Trusted by hunters, he's adopted by the military, celebrated by gun enthusiasts worldwide. It had a secret, and Remington had known about it for decades. The rifle's trigger mechanism, called the Walker Fire Control after its designer Merle Mike Walker, had a defect. Under certain conditions, the rifle could fire without anyone pulling the trigger. A component called the trigger connector could allow debris, moisture, or even normal wear to create a gap that permitted the firing pin to release spontaneously. The gun could discharge when the safety was switched off. It could discharge when the bolt was closed. It could discharge while sitting in a case on the tailgate of a pickup truck. Merle Walker himself had proposed a safer trigger design in 1948, while the Model 700 was still being developed. The alternative would have eliminated the trigger connector entirely. Remington's management rejected it. The reason? The safer design would have increased the cost of each rifle by approximately 6 cents. 6 cents. Internal Remington documents dating to the mid-1970s showed that company engineers had duplicated the accidental discharge in laboratory testing. They knew the gun could fire without a trigger pull. They documented it. They filed it away. When customers called to report that their rifles had discharged unexpectedly, company representatives were instructed to treat each complaint as an isolated incident. They were told to say that every case was unique. They were told not to mention that thousands of other customers had reported the same problem. Picture this: a family on a hunting trip in Montana, October 2000. A mother points her Model 700 into an empty horse trailer to safely unload it. Her 9-year-old son, Gus Barber, runs behind the trailer at the wrong moment. The trigger mechanism releases without being touched. The rifle fires. The boy falls. He bleeds to death while his father watches. Barbara Barber has said she is certain her hand was nowhere near the trigger. Her husband, Rich, spent the next 2 decades amassing internal Remington documents and pushing the company for answers it never intended to give. At least 24 people were killed by accidental discharges from Model 700 rifles. More than 100 were seriously injured. Over 75 lawsuits were filed. In 2007, Remington introduced a new trigger mechanism called the X-Mark Pro, which eliminated the controversial connector. But they never recalled the 5 million rifles already in circulation with the Walker trigger. They never told the public what they had known since the 1970s. In 2014, a class action settlement forced Remington to offer trigger replacements on 7.85 million rifles. Some owners reported that their guns malfunctioned after the repair was performed. The recall covered only economic losses, not wrongful death claims. For 4 decades, Remington sold a rifle it knew could kill without anyone pulling the trigger. The fix would have cost 6 cents per unit. 24 people died. And the company's primary concern, documented in its own internal files, was that a recall would undermine its public messaging about firearm safety. That's the thing about choosing profit over safety. The bill always comes. Miss, it just arrives later than the people making the decision expect. And by the time it lands, those people are gone. The people who absorb the consequences never are. While the trigger scandal smoldered beneath the surface, the broader firearms market was shifting under Remington's feet. The long gun market that had been the company's foundation for a century and a half was in structural decline. The National Shooting Sports Foundation reported that interest in hunting had been falling since the mid-1980s. Rifle and shotgun sales, which had totaled $900 million in 1992, were stagnating while the handgun market was growing. Remington, the long gun king, was sitting on the wrong side of a market rotation it hadn't anticipated and couldn't reverse. Then came the Obama presidency, and the American firearms industry experienced something unprecedented. Between 2008 and 2016, gun sales surged to record levels. The driver wasn't hunting, it was fear. Conservative media stoked anxiety that the Obama administration would impose sweeping gun control measures. Consumers rushed to buy rifles and ammunition before the anticipated crackdown materialized. Remington, through its Freedom Group subsidiary Bushmaster, was suddenly selling AR-15-style rifles at a pace nobody had anticipated. Sales climbed from about 100,000 units annually to over 2 million by 2012. Remington expanded production. They hired workers. They ran extra shifts. They invested in capacity to meet demand that showed no signs of slowing. And then Donald Trump won the 2016 presidential election. Overnight, the fear that had driven 8 years of panic buying evaporated. Gun enthusiasts no longer worried about impending restrictions. Sales collapsed. The FBI reported a significant drop in background checks for firearm purchases in 2017. Remington, which had scaled up production to meet Obama-era demand, was suddenly sitting on warehouses full of inventory that nobody wanted to buy. The company couldn't cut costs fast enough. It couldn't service the $1 billion in debt that Cerberus had strapped to it. The interest payments kept coming. The revenue kept falling. The factory in Ilion, with its million square feet of aging infrastructure, kept burning cash, whether guns were shipping or not. What came next was the reckoning. 2 bankruptcies, a mass shooting that changed the national conversation, and a $73 million bill for the marketing decisions that had fueled Remington's last desperate boom. On the morning of December 14, 2012, a 20-year-old man walked into Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut, carrying a Bushmaster XM15E2S semi-automatic rifle. The Bushmaster was a variant of the AR-15, manufactured by a Remington subsidiary. Within minutes, he had killed 20 children and 6 educators. The children were first graders, 6 and 7 years old. This was the same company that had armed the Union Army. The same company whose rolling block had been declared the finest rifle in the world at the Paris Exposition. The same company whose 870 shotgun hung above the mantles of 1 million American homes. And now a weapon, bearing its corporate lineage, had been carried into an elementary school and used to murder children who still believed in Santa Claus. The weapon hadn't malfunctioned. It performed exactly as designed. The question that would consume the next decade of litigation was not whether the gun worked, but how and to whom it had been marketed. Remington, through its Bushmaster brand, had sold the AR-15 with language and imagery calibrated for a very specific demographic: young men searching for an identity they could purchase. The advertisements treated combat weaponry as an extension of masculine worth. One campaign carried the tagline that would become central to the lawsuit: "Consider your man card reissued." The messaging linked firearm ownership to power, to dominance, to the reclamation of something that had been taken. It wasn't selling a hunting rifle. It wasn't selling home defense. It was selling a fantasy of militarized masculinity to men who had never worn a uniform. Here's the kicker. Remington had also licensed the Bushmaster ACR, another AR-15 variant, for inclusion in the Call of Duty video game franchise. Players could select the weapon in-game, experience its simulated recoil, and use it to shoot targets that resembled human beings. Before this licensing deal, the only way to experience what an AR-15 felt like was to visit a gun range. Now a teenager on a couch could get a simulation. No age verification, no background check, no parental consent. The marketing funnel ran from a video game console to a gun store counter, and nobody along that path was required to ask whether this was a good idea. The families of 9 Sandy Hook victims sued Remington in December 2014. They argued that the company had negligently marketed a military weapon to civilians and that its advertising violated Connecticut's Unfair Trade Practices Act. The legal obstacles seemed insurmountable. In 2005, Congress had passed the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which shielded gun manufacturers from civil liability for crimes committed with their products. Experts called the Sandy Hook case a losing proposition. The family's attorney, Josh Koskoff, found a narrow exception. The federal shield law allowed claims based on marketing practices that violated state consumer protection statutes. Koskoff argued that Remington had crossed that line by glorifying violence and targeting vulnerable populations. The case fought through the courts. The Connecticut Supreme Court ruled in 2019 that the families could proceed. Remington appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The court declined to hear the case. 7 years of litigation produced thousands of pages of internal documents, marketing strategies, demographic analyses, licensing agreements, internal communications. The documents revealed a company that had deliberately cultivated an association between its products and military-style combat in the minds of civilian consumers. The families demanded not just money, but transparency. No documents, no deal. In February 2022, Remington agreed to pay $73 million, the largest settlement ever paid by a gun manufacturer for a mass shooting. Every dollar of available insurance coverage emptied out. The settlement admitted no liability, which is standard, but the financial message was absolute. The company that had paid this price no longer existed as a functioning entity. The first bankruptcy had come in March 2018. Remington entered Chapter 11 with roughly $700 million in debt. Cerberus Capital surrendered its ownership stake. The creditors, J.P. Morgan Chase and Franklin Advisors among them, took control. Bank of America and 6 other lenders extended $193 million in emergency financing. Remington emerged within 2 months. Nothing fundamental changed. The debt had been reduced, but not eliminated. The aging factory still consumed cash. The civilian market remained weak. The legal liabilities kept accumulating. The restructuring was a bandage on a wound that required amputation. In July 2020, Remington filed for bankruptcy again. This time, there would be no emergence. The company's assets were put on the auction block. You would divide it among bidders, like the possessions of a dead man. Vista Outdoor purchased the ammunition business for $81.4 million. The Ilion factory and the rights to manufacture Remington-branded firearms went to a group called the Roundhill Group for $13 million. $13 million for the birthplace of America's oldest gunmaker, for a factory that had produced weapons for the Union Army, armed the Allied powers through 2 world wars, and manufactured the most popular sporting firearms in American history. $13 million wouldn't cover a modest apartment in Manhattan. It bought the entirety of Remington's manufacturing heritage. Here's the thing about that auction. The Navajo Nation had submitted a bid of between $475 million and $525 million during the first bankruptcy in 2018. Their proposal would have stopped civilian sales of AR-15 style rifles, invested in developing smart gun technology, and employed Navajo tribal members in manufacturing positions. It was a plan to rebuild the company around defense contracts and responsible civilian firearms. Management rejected it. They chose the path that led to a second bankruptcy, a fire sale, and a $13 million price tag. Let that sink in. A $500 million offer from a sovereign nation turned down in favor of financial engineering that ended with a 208-year-old company sold for pocket change. Roundhill reopened the Ilion factory in the spring of 2021 under a new entity called Rem Arms. About 200 workers returned to floors that had once held 3,000. In November 2021, Rem Arms announced it was relocating its headquarters to LaGrange, Georgia, allured by a $100 million incentive package, lower labor costs, weaker unions, a state legislature that wouldn't pass gun control laws. The dismantling began. In January 2023, production of the Model 700 rifle, the gun that had defined Remington for 6 decades, was moved from Ilion to the Georgia facility. Then, on November 30th, 2023, employees were summoned to a staff meeting on the 4th floor. They were told that Rem Arms would cease all operations at Ilion on or about March 4th, 2024. Every worker would be terminated. 309 people. The mayor of Ilion, John Stevens, learned about it from the news. Not from the company, from the news. His father had worked at the factory for 37 years. The mayor had been trying to reach Rem Arms owners since the day he took office. Nobody returned his calls? Picture this. Monday, March 4th, 2024. The last shift ends. Workers emerge from the factory entrance on Hofler Avenue, one by one, carrying whatever personal items they'd kept at their stations. Some wave. Some stare at the ground. Across the street, a small crowd of residents has gathered to watch. Among them is a woman named Debbie Mullen. Her brother works at the factory. Her cousins work at the factory. She holds a small canvas with a red heart painted on it, lifting it toward each worker as they pass. They always call Remington the heart of Ilion, she said. It says it all right here. The workers disappeared into the parking lot, the doors closed behind them. And just like that, 208 years of continuous manufacturing ended on a Monday afternoon in the Mohawk Valley. What do you do with a town whose reason for existing just walked out the door? Walk through Ilion today, and the factory is the first thing you see. It's the first thing you see because it's impossible to miss. 1 million square feet of brick and steel and silence spread across 34 acres in the dead center of a village of 7,600 people. The buildings stretch along what used to be the Erie Canal Corridor, the same waterway that Eliphalet Remington chose in 1828 because it connected his forge to the world. The canal is quiet now. The factory is quieter. Mayor John Stevens can see it from his office window. He doesn't have to walk far. He can cross the hall, look through the glass, and there it is, filling the horizon like a monument to something that used to matter. His father worked those floors for 37 years. The mayor grew up understanding that Remington and Ilion were the same word. Now he governs a village with 1 million square foot hole in its center, and no clear plan for what fills it. The economic damage is immediate and measurable. 309 workers terminated. 12 weeks of severance. Unused vacation paid out. Some found work at Revere Copper Products in nearby Rome. Many didn't find work at all. The United Mine Workers of America, which represented many of the Ilion employees, issued a statement. Without these workers and their dedication to producing the best firearms in the world, this company simply would not exist. They were right, and it didn't matter. The secondary damage is harder to quantify, but no less real. Franco's Pizza, which had delivered lunches to the factory for years, watched its orders thin out week by week after the closure. The owner's assessment was measured and devastating. This is not necessarily going to put us out of business, but it does hurt. Multiply that sentence across every barbershop, every gas station, every landlord, every property tax roll in the village, and you begin to understand what a factory closure means in a town this size. It's not one business failing. It's the circulatory system of an entire community losing its heart. The village seal still features Eliphalet Remington holding a long gun. Nobody has changed it. Nobody has proposed changing it. 208 years of shared identity don't vanish because a holding company moves to Georgia. The streets still carry the names Armory Street. The buildings still carry the scars. The parking lots are still painted with faded lines where 3 shifts' worth of pickup trucks used to fill and empty with the rhythm of a tidal clock. The physical infrastructure of a company town remains perfectly intact. What's missing is the company. Here's the thing, this story isn't unique. Ilion joins a roster of American communities that built themselves around a single manufacturer, watched that manufacturer get hollowed out by financial engineering, and were left holding the bill when the name moved somewhere cheaper. Colts Manufacturing did it to Hartford, Connecticut. Kodak did it to Rochester, New York. Bethlehem Steel did it to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Singer did it to Elizabeth, New Jersey. The details change. The names change. The arc never does. A founder builds something real. A community grows around it. Generations invest their labor and their loyalty. Then the owners change, the debt piles up, the factory closes, and the people who made it all possible are treated as a line item to be eliminated. So, what are the lessons? Not the polished lessons of a business school case study. The real ones. The ones that cost people their livelihoods and their identities. Lesson 1. Private equity kills what it buys. Cerberus Capital Management acquired Remington in 2007 and loaded it with nearly $1 billion in debt. They used a 2013 debt offering to pay off their own investors with money the company had borrowed. They starved the factory of capital for modernization, research, and quality control. The company was profitable. In 2016, Remington earned $19 million in profit after paying $45 million in interest. The business worked. The financial structure didn't. By the time Cerberus surrendered its stake in the 2018 bankruptcy, the damage was irreversible. This is not a story about a company that failed. It's a story about a company that was made to fail. Lesson 2. Covering up defects destroys trust, and it destroys lives. The Model 700 trigger defect was documented in Remington's own laboratories in the 1970s. A safer design had been proposed by the trigger's own inventor in 1948, rejected because it cost 6 cents more per rifle. For 40 years, Remington sold a gun it knew could fire without anyone pulling the trigger. 24 people died. More than 100 were seriously injured. 7.85 million rifles were eventually recalled. When you choose profit over safety, the bill comes due. It just arrives later than the people making the decision expect. And those people are never the ones who pay it. Lesson 3. Marketing has consequences. Consider your man card reissued was not a slogan dreamed up by an intern. It was a deliberate strategy to associate military-grade weaponry with masculine identity, targeted at young men who had never served and never would. Remington licensed its rifles to video game franchises so that teenagers could experience the product before they were old enough to buy it. 20 children died in a classroom, and the weapon that killed them had been marketed like a lifestyle brand. The $73 million settlement was the largest ever paid by a gun manufacturer for a mass shooting. Companies own the culture they build around their products. When that culture produces violence, the responsibility doesn't evaporate because the trigger was pulled by someone else. Lesson 4. War is not a business model. This is the oldest lesson in the Remington story, and it's the one nobody ever learns. The company boomed during the Civil War and collapsed afterward. It boomed during World War I and collapsed afterward. It boomed during World War II and would have collapsed again without DuPont's patient capital. It boomed during the Obama-era panic buying and collapsed when the panic ended. Every generation of Remington's management believed this time was different. None of them were right. A business built on fear and conflict will always be at the mercy of peace. Lesson 5. Communities are not externalities. When Remington moved to Georgia, it took the name, the brand, and the production contracts. It did not take the 7,600 people who lived in Ilion. It did not take the families who had worked the factory for 3 and 4 generations. It did not take the pizza shop that delivered lunches, or the bars that filled up after shift changes, or the churches that scheduled services around the factory clock. It did not take the tax base that funded the schools and plowed the roads. All of that stayed behind. The village seal still features Eliphalet Remington holding a long gun, and the village still exists, and the people in it still need jobs and purpose, and a reason to believe that their labor mattered. A $100 million incentive package from Georgia bought Remington's name. Nothing bought Ilion's future. The factory that Eliphalet Remington built beside the Erie Canal in 1828 still stands at 14 Hofler Avenue. The bricks laid during the World War I expansion are still there, the same bricks that workers passed every morning for 100 years. The windows that let natural light fall across the production floor in 1943 are still set in their frames. The parking lot where 3,000 pickup trucks once jammed every afternoon is empty now, the painted lines fading into asphalt. Remington rifles are still manufactured. They are produced in LaGrange, Georgia by a holding company called Remington Arms, which purchased the right to use the name at a bankruptcy auction for $13 million. The guns ship with the Remington stamp. They are not made by the hands that made them for 2 centuries. They are not forged on the floors where Eliphalet's sons learned their trade. They carry a name that no longer belongs to the place that created it. Eliphalet Remington walked 15 miles to Utica in 1816 with a barrel he had hammered from scrap iron. He entered a shooting match and finished second. He walked home with a fistful of orders and no idea that he had just started something that would last 208 years. 2 centuries later, the last workers walked out of the factory his family built, and a woman standing across the street held up a small canvas with a red heart on it. The heart is still there. The body it belonged to is gone.